I'd like to welcome everybody to this repeat program on osteoporosis, and we're very, very happy to have Dr. Clark back again. There's a lot of people here I can see who don't live at the Highlands, and a lot of people who must live in the community, so welcome to the Highlands if you've never been here before. I'd like to introduce Amy Landry, who's going to talk a little bit about Parkview and Dr. Clark. The gentleman out back is from the local television cable station, so he's going to be televising bits and pieces of this program. So anyway, welcome, and Amy, thank you. And hopefully everybody has a seat now. We've robbed seats from all over the place.
That's right. Does everybody have a seat? Raise your hand. Well, thank you for coming. We host this series called Parkview's Living Well Lecture Series, and Dr. Clark has graciously been one of our speakers several times, and obviously he's very popular with you all, so I won't talk a lot so that he'll be back. Just wanted to let you know that we do a lot of community events like this. If this is your first one or you haven't been to many of them, please stop by our wellness department or give us a call, and we'd be more than willing to tell you a little bit more about what we do. You can call us at 373-2162. If anyone wants to write that again, it's 373-2162. That is our wellness department, and we can tell you about all the other talks that we do. Dr. Clark has been with us now for how long?
Almost a year.
Almost a year. And he's done several talks. He was in our women's conference last year when we really kind of introduced him to the community. He's one of our orthopedic surgeons and knows a lot about osteoporosis as well as lifestyle medicine. And I'll let him take it away.
Thank you, Amy. Does this sound about right for you? Okay, so you've all come today to learn about osteoporosis. Well, I was reading an interesting study the other day that was done on people in Maine. Somebody studied people that were just above Bangor, 45th, latitude, and parallel, and they found out that people up there lose about 3% of their bone in the winter, and then they gain it back in the summer, and they cycle back and forth. It's because they don't get much sunlight. Very interesting study. So if you feel like you're down right now, maybe there's a reason. Maybe you'll catch back up next summer. Of course, we've had a lot of good sunlight this winter, haven't we? But believe it or not, the sunlight we get during the winter in Maine is not the sunlight that'll make vitamin D and help your bones. It's because the sun is so low on the horizon that the light we need doesn't make it over. So it's kind of a problem. Osteoporosis. You see I have my little ladies here getting shorter and shorter. Oh boy, well that's what osteoporosis is all about. And the NIH has given us a definition. Primary osteoporosis is an age-related disorder characterized by decreased bone mass and an increasing susceptibility to fractures in the absence of other recognizable causes of bone loss. Means your bones get thin and they break. And that's not good. I treat a lot of people with fractures. They aren't happy people. That's not a good thing to have happen to you. Now here is a vertebra. It's spinning around, and we're going to go inside the vertebra, and here are what we call trabecula. That's what the bone is made of. That's the structure of the bone. And it's those trabecula that get too thin in osteoporosis. Here's normal bone. It's got lots of good calcium. The structure is strong. Over here is osteoporotic bone. Notice the thin trabecula. That's a problem. It's kind of like the bridge you came over if you came over from Brunswick. This is a different bridge, but kind of looks as similar, doesn't it? Well, if your bone has all the trabecula, it's strong. How many of these girders would you allow to be missing and still want to drive across that bridge? How about that one right there? See, bone, as you start losing trabecula, it loses strength. And that's a problem. Oops, I hit the wrong button there. Okay, 34 million Americans have what we call osteopenia. Their bones are thin, but they don't quite yet qualify for osteoporosis. And then we have approximately 10 million Americans that have been diagnosed with osteoporosis. 80% of that is women. We'll get into why that is a little bit later, if you're feeling picked on. Okay, here is the incidence of different fractures. First of all, I'm going to put the age across the bottom, 50 years old, 60, 70, 80. Up here is the annual incidence. Now look at this. This is wrist fractures. Notice that during the perimenopausal and postmenopausal years, the incidence of wrist fractures goes up. That's because the osteoporosis associated with menopause affects the bone at the end of the bones. We call it trabecular bone. It doesn't affect the cortical bone or the hard bone quite as much. And so you tend to have these fractures, especially in the wrist. The next one is the hip. Notice that the hip stays fairly strong until retirement. Oh, important point. If you sit down and do nothing, your bones are going to say, well, if you're not going to do anything, I'm just going to get up and leave. And that's what happens. The bones get weak after retirement. People aren't as active, and hip fractures rise precipitously. Then there's the vertebral fractures. They just tend to go up and up and up. All right. Here's a picture of our fractures. There's 1.5 million fractures per year in the United States associated with osteoporosis. That's quite a lot. 300,000 hip fractures, 700,000 vertebral fractures, 250,000 wrist fractures, a bunch of other fractures. We're going to look especially at those fractures. Now, this is a wrist x-ray, and this is a fracture. This should look like a golf tee with the wrist like the golf ball, but it's fallen off backwards. I can't tell you how many times I see these in the emergency room. And it's a lot of times people with osteoporosis. 250,000 of them. 1/5 get hospitalized, either due to the fact that they had to have surgery, or because they have so much pain, or because it made them so disabled they couldn't take care of themselves at home. And then there's about 500,000 physician visits go into those wrist fractures. It's a lot of visits, because we have to see you more than once to take care of that fracture. Now this is a spine x-ray. Can you see how square that vertebra is? It's like a coffee cup, right? Nice and square and round. Well, here's another one. Nice vertebra. But in between here are a bunch of vertebrae that are shaped like a wedge. They have crushed, or we say compressed. They are compression fractures, and pretty soon that's what causes the bending over of the spine, kyphosis. And as you get older, the prevalence of spinal deformities due to osteoporotic fractures goes up. Until 95-year-olds, about 75% of them have some kind of deformity. What are the clinical consequences? We call this bending over kyphosis. Well, the kyphosis makes it so you lose height. You get shorter. You go to the doctor and he says, now you're only 5'6". You say, but I wasn't that short before. Well, stand a little straighter then. And you can't. It won't work. Then you start having pain all the time. It changes the way your muscles have to work to keep you up straight. And your abdomen begins to bulge. Well, that's not good, because there's a lot of important organs down there in your abdomen. GI symptoms start happening with reflux. And then you have difficulty breathing because your abdomen's trying to push up in your chest. Oh, then you get depressed because all this is happening. Oh, and then we call that a reduced quality of life. So I guess what I'm saying is avoid osteoporosis. Okay, we'll tell you how to do that though. Hip fractures. You know, if you break your hip, you can't walk. That's a big problem. If you can't walk, then more osteoporosis sets in. Osteoporosis is responsible for 80% of hip fractures. The rest of them are just plain trauma. But it costs a lot of money to take care of hip fractures because you'll definitely be put in the hospital. $18 million in 2002. How many wish they had billion dollars? Yeah, well, we're spending it on hip fractures. A lot of people die of this too, believe it or not. 15,000 deaths per year. Well, you don't necessarily die because you broke your hip. You end up dying because you get pneumonia or congestive heart failure or a heart attack or something else. But the health of the bones is kind of a barometer to the health of the whole person. And if you're really healthy, a lot of times osteoporosis won't set in. Now, these deaths we're going to talk a little more about, but I'm just kind of painting a picture as to how big a problem this osteoporosis is before we go into how to fix it. Here's a map. And the darker the color, the more osteoporosis in that part of the world. And just because we have a white spot up there doesn't mean a whole lot. That means nobody lives there. And we kind of knew that, didn't we? All right. Hip fractures. 35% of post-menopausal white women have osteoporosis of the hip, spine, or wrist. Well, is it getting better or worse? I mean, with time. Well, we figure by the year 2020, 50% of Americans over the age of 50 will have osteoporosis of the hip. Well, that's no good. I'm going to be too busy. Because the main way I treat osteoporosis is with cobalt chrome or stainless steel, screws and plates, so it's a lot of work. All right, 1/5 of patients die within a year of having a hip fracture. Whoa, that's kind of like a death sentence, isn't it? That's not good. And that's just the epidemiology of it. That isn't something we cause or anything. Here is a DEXA scan report. They scan your body and they put out this report, and this is kind of the gold standard that we use for checking people's bones. If you think you're osteoporotic or osteopenic, we send you to the DEXA scan. The DEXA scan is measured in standard deviation. This person's normal because the little mark is right on the center line, and it's in the green. But for each standard deviation you go down, your bone is getting more thin. And for each standard deviation of bone loss, there is a 30% increase in mortality from hip fracture. So if your bones are normal and you break your hip, you probably won't die. If your standard deviation is down here at 5, your risks are pretty high. Disability. 1/4 of hip fracture patients become disabled the following year. That's the ones that didn't die. So it's a lot of people end up with disability. 2/3 never return to the same activity level again. It's a problem. In 1995, which is the most recent statistic I could find, 140,000 people ended up in the nursing home as a result of hip fracture. And 1/5, that's the ones that didn't die, end up staying in the nursing home the rest of their life. Long-term care. Quality of life. We have this scale we call quality of life scale, and they go around measuring quality of life. For spine fractures, there's a 20% reduction in quality of life, but for hip fractures, there's a 52% reduction in quality of life the first year after the fracture. Hip fractures are bad, I guess I'm saying, huh? All right, the emotional impact. 68% worry that another fracture will put them in a nursing home. 73% are concerned that they will have to reduce activity with family and friends. Isolation, loneliness. Oh, I guess I will just stay home this time. I don't think I want to walk around that park. What if I fell down and broke something? 80% fear losing independence, and 89% fear breaking another bone. That's a lot of emotional impact, isn't it? Well, what causes osteoporosis? Okay, we're through with the emotional impact. Let's talk about the causes. I got all kinds of causes that will line up here on the screen. I won't cover all of them in detail, but I'm going to cover some of the major ones. The first one is sugar, believe it or not. Did you know sugar causes osteoporosis? Yep, And Americans are eating more and more sugar every year, more refined foods. It's hard on the system. Then there's low estrogen. We can't always do something about that, but that is a problem. Then there's inactivity. If you just sit down and do nothing, your bones will say, well, if you're not going to do anything, I'm going to get up and leave. And they do. They get thinner and thinner. It's like the roads in Maine. You know, you put a lot of pavement on the freeway out here, but you don't put much pavement on a driveway. Well, the bones are like that. They're not going to put a bunch of calcium down in a bone that's not going to get used. And then there's excess alcohol. 2 reasons. 1, you're probably not eating good stuff. And number 2, the alcohol is a poison to all the little cells in the bone. And then there's high phosphates. And there's phosphoric acid pop. We'll talk more about phosphates and where you get your phosphates in your diet. But phosphates tend to leach calcium out of the system. And then there's vitamin D deficiency. We start out by saying that the people in Maine, their bones cycle about 3% up and down in bone density per year. They're higher at the end of the summer and lower at the end of the winter. Well, that has everything to do with vitamin D. Sometimes supplementation is a good idea. And then there's excess salt. It competes with calcium. They're both positive ions. And then there's steroids. Now, I put on here prednisone, but people who are under a lot of stress have a lot more steroids in their system. So that would be another source of steroids. Smoking, and we'll talk about how much that impacts the bones. Caffeine, chronic stress, and animal protein. Well, there you have some of the major causes of primary osteoporosis. What about secondary osteoporosis? Secondary means something else is causing it that we can identify more clearly. Medications, heparin, anticonvulsants, and methotrexate, just to name a few. And then other conditions, renal failure, hyperthyroid, hyperparathyroid, diabetes mellitus, multiple myeloma, and chronic depression. Chronic depression? Well, that's interesting. Chronic depression. I remember a text something about that. Proverbs 17:22. A merry heart doth good like a medicine, but a broken spirit drieth the bones. Well, isn't that interesting? Okay, how much do each of these factors affect your bones? Lifestyle factors and hip fracture risk. First of all, currently smoking doubles your risk of osteoporosis and hip fractures. History of maternal hip fracture. Can't do much about that, can you? Well, if your parents had hip fractures, you are at double the risk of having a hip fracture too. Why is that? Certain bone structures are inherited. Certain diets are also inherited in lifestyles. And so it all plays into the picture. Then there's a resting pulse rate, greater than 80 beats per minute. Well, that just means you're a couch potato. If your heart runs fast, it means you're not getting enough exercise. You're out of shape. And so you're not using your bones. You're not stressing them. Then there is the current caffeine intake. 1.5 cups of coffee per day correlates to about a 30% increase in osteoporosis. But who stops with 1.5 cups? A lot of people will drink the whole pot, right? All right. What's that? I said yes, a 30% increase. That would be a 1.3 relative risk. All right. Factors that don't make a lot of difference. Using estrogen tends not to change it either way, just gives you a higher risk of cancer. Then there's the... That wasn't supposed to be funny. All right. Daily calcium intake helps a little bit, but you'll see that you could eat an awful lot of calcium and it won't make a great deal of difference in a future slide. What are things that really make a difference? I'm just going to put a couple up here and then we'll talk about more later, but these are the ones that we have a relative risk for. First of all is walking for exercise. You're loading the bones. You're giving them something to think about, and they feel like they're useful. That reduces it by 30%. And then staying on your feet more than 4 hours per day. Well, that's a good thing to do. Be up on your feet. That's what they're made for, and that reduces it by 40%. So weight bearing is one of the biggest things you can do for hip fracture, reducing the risk of hip fracture. Okay, bones are always biologically active. They're always being remodeled. It's like the roads in Maine. They're always under construction all summer long, right? Come along and fill the potholes. That's the way bones are. They're always changing. By age 25, bone has reached maturity. By 35, there's peak bone mass. They're as strong as they'll ever be. By 40, you're starting to lose a little bit of bone, about 0.5% per year. And there's going to be a quiz on this slide, so look careful. By 45, bone loss could be 3% per year in the perimenopausal years. And if that continues for 10 years, you could lose 30% of your bone mass. That's a lot. Okay, remember that 3%. Calcium. Here's what it's all about. Calcium balance. 900 milligrams in, some lost in the stool, some lost in the urine. There's a bunch of it in the bones and some of it in the blood. And it all floats around back and forth. We'll talk about this balance a little more. But what we want to know is that the bones are the bank. That's where you got to put your money, right? Okay. That's because 99% of your calcium is in the bones. That's where it lives, or that's where you want it to live. How do you make withdrawals? Well, there's these cells that come along. They're the ones that take up the old pavement. They're called osteoclasts. And they take up the old bone that's not being used or that's worn out. And along come the osteoblasts, and they make deposits. They repair the road. They put down new calcium. Those are the cells responsible for the calcium balance in your bones. All right, so we're talking about calcium. Here's, let's see, coral calcium. Calcium for your pets. Tums. Calcium daily supplement. Well, Newsweek had this cover one time to ward off everything from osteoporosis to cancer. Americans are buying millions of dollars worth of calcium and other mineral supplements. Do these miracle minerals help? What are the risks? Good question, huh? All right. Daily calcium allowance. National Academy of Sciences. Yes, they said you should have 800 milligrams. Well, that's a lot of calcium, but why'd they say that? Well, along came the NIH and they said, osteoporosis is an epidemic. Let's have everybody take 1,500 milligrams of calcium. Okay. All right. Well, along came the WHO, World Health Organization, and they said, what? They looked around, they says, we rarely find osteoporosis in the whatever 10 billion people there are on Earth. How about just taking 500 milligrams of calcium? Well, that's confusing. Is osteoporosis a deficiency disease or a disease of dietary excess and abundance? Well, let's look at the calcium balance and how important each part of it is. In other words, how much can we influence each aspect of osteoporosis? Look here, we have intake, absorption, loss in the stool, and how much is in the urine. Notice that we have the greatest influence over how much calcium goes out in the urine. That's where we better put our money. Yes. Okay, here is my chart. Osteoporosis, urinary calcium. That's what we're going to look at. Here's how much protein you're eating per day, how much calcium is ending up in the urine, and what the balance was according to this study. Okay, if a person was getting 47 grams of protein per day, their urinary calcium was 168 in the study. And when they did all their figuring and the day was over, they said you had a positive balance of 31 milligrams. Well, if you could put $31 in the bank every day for the rest of your life, you could retire, couldn't you? That's quite a lot. Okay, double the protein and all of a sudden the amount of calcium going down in the urine increased and we're in a negative balance. If you lost $58 a day, you'd never be able to retire. Oh, that's not good. Triple the protein and wow, the calcium balance goes way down. That's not good. Osteoporosis, here we come. Well, okay, so where is all that calcium coming from? Well, here's the same protein and the urinary calcium. Oh, what's this? N-telopeptide. That's a little protein in the bone that's associated with the calcium. When the calcium leaves, the N-telopeptide comes out of the bone and it ends up in the urine. In other words, if I find N-telopeptide in the urine, calcium came out of the bone. It didn't come from anywhere else. Alright, same amount of protein. In this study, the urinary calcium was 108. We'll call that baseline because that looked good on the last slide. Let's just up the protein a little bit to 70 grams of protein. All of a sudden our urinary calcium jumped up, but our N-telopeptide increased by 33%. The calcium that you lose in your urine associated with eating too much protein comes from the bones. And if we triple the protein, the N-telopeptide goes up even higher. Okay, let's go on and see how this works. Here is a chart I have where I have the percent increase in urinary calcium excretion right here. So this is normal calcium in the urine. This would be 50% more calcium in the urine. This would be 100% more. Down here I have that high protein diet. That increases the calcium in your urine by 81%. That's what we've been talking about here. That would be that N-telopeptide of 47% increase, or the negative calcium balance of, what was it, 129? Okay, that is with the protein. How about aspartame? Eating lots of aspartame, NutraSweet, increases your excretion of calcium by 86%. What about sugar? Glucose. Getting too much sugar in your diet? Whoa, 124%. And I don't even have any studies on N-telopeptide for that. And then what about chocolate? Don't anybody leave. Alright, chocolate is almost 150% increase in calcium loss. There goes the chocolate, somebody said. Okay, well, I'm not advertising for any companies here. Alright, protein and calcium. Notice I have my scales here. Which is more important, to work on getting more calcium or reducing your protein? Let's just study that. Well, what happens if you get too much protein, first of all? It acts like a diuretic because the protein is metabolized to urea. It's a nitrogen product, and it acts like a diuretic and washes the calcium out of your system. There's also a lot of phosphates and sulfates in a lot of the protein, especially protein high in the amino acid methionine. Now, I'm probably getting too technical there, but some amino acids form a lot more acid than others. And it so happens that animal protein is high in those amino acids. Okay, let's just put up a chart here. And here's our calcium pill, 1,400 milligrams. That's a big pill. Don't want to swallow that all at once. That's probably a bunch of little pills, but it's a bunch of them. Okay, what happens with 1,400 milligrams of calcium per day if we have our same amount of protein? 48 grams, double it, triple it again. Okay, here is 0, and here's positive, and here's negative balance. If we take and eat our diet that only has 48 grams of protein, we have a 20 milligram increase in calcium in our bones or bodies every day. Well, if I could put $20 in the bank every day for the rest of my life, I could probably retire. Yeah, all right. How about if I double the protein, though? All of a sudden, I'm losing 30 milligrams a day. Well, I heard a saying. If your income is less than your outgo, then your upkeep will be your downfall. You ever heard that? All right, there you go. And here we go. We have triple the protein, and oh, we're losing calcium. So in other words, the point of this slide is you cannot eat enough calcium to offset the effect of eating too much protein. You could eat bricks of calcium and it wouldn't offset that problem. Partly because too much protein makes it so you don't absorb the calcium. Alright, calcium balance. Let's just take an average day in somebody's life. Alright, calcium intake, 1392. They ate some nice green leafy vegetables with lots of calcium and they, well, took a few Tums or something. They got quite a bit of calcium intake. Then they lost a little bit of calcium in their urine, 147 according to this study. Okay, well, that's a little loss. Then they lost some in the stool, just stuff that didn't get absorbed. And they sweated a little bit. Well, add and subtract, get us all the, okay, that's positive 76. Well, that's good. Y'all like math? I didn't get any takers on that. I guess okay, let's see, let's try another one. Let's say they didn't get quite as much calcium, 1380. They ate a lot more protein. They lost 196 in their urine. The protein kept them from absorbing as much. They lost 1225 in the stool. They worked a little harder, lost a little more in the sweat. And what do we get if we add it up? A negative 50. Oh no, negative 50, and that's what osteoporosis is all about, is losing calcium. If I keep losing 50 milligrams of calcium a day for 365 days a year for 30 years, I could lose 540 grams of calcium. That's a lot of calcium to lose. I only started out with 1,300 grams. That's a 42% loss of calcium in my bones. Wow. Well, how much protein do I need anyway? That's the question, isn't it? How much protein do I need? If the protein's causing this problem, well, this is the osteoporosis protein connection. So that's what we want to talk about here for a little bit. Well, there was a doctor, Dr. Carl Voigt. He was a pretty good guy, and he wanted to figure out for people how much protein they needed. He lived back in the 1800s. He went around the community and said, well, who are the rich people? Who are the hard-working people? Who are the people that look like they're productive, and we want more of them around in our society? Well, he came across these rich barons and so forth, and he says, well, how much, what do you eat? And he looked, and lo and behold, they were eating about 118 grams of protein per day. Well, he was on to something. He went down to the newspaper and said, publish it! Everybody should get 118 grams of protein, and everybody will be rich, and everybody will be hardworking. And well, 118 grams in 1881. Well, his theory didn't last long. Along came Russell Henry Chittenden, and he said, now, wait a minute. Those people didn't get rich by eating all that protein. They could only afford that protein because they were rich. And he started shooting down the theory. He said, now, what you need is just 60 grams of protein. Well, still wasn't all that scientific, huh? But at least it was coming down, right? Headed the right direction. Well, along came a gentleman, Dr. Hindedy. Dr. Hindedy was in Denmark during World War I. Denmark had a problem during World War I. They were kind of cut off from the rest of the world. The rest of the world wasn't sending them care packages. And so they ended up with no grain to feed cattle. And so they set up a whole program of rationing food so that everybody would get enough. Well, they ended up eating a lot of potatoes, a lot of vegetables, almost no meat, no butter, no margarine, no tea, coffee, or beer. And interestingly enough, the death rate in Denmark fell to the lowest it had ever fallen in any civilized country in the history of the world. 10.9 per thousand. That's about 1%. Well, if only 1% of the people died every year, you'd probably all live to be 100, I guess. Well, that was... But then he looked around to see how much protein they were eating. He says, wow, everybody's healthy. How much protein are they getting? And he said, after studying it, that 14 grams of protein a day made people very healthy, strong, and able to do anything they wanted to do. He put himself on that amount of protein and found no ill effects, and so he suggested 40. Well, it's still not real scientific, is it? Everybody's just looking around and guessing, aren't they? Well, along came the scientist, Dr. William Rose. We're going to talk more about Dr. Rose because he's kind of set the standard for us. Dr. Rose figured out what the 8 essential amino acids were, how much you needed of each of those 8 essential amino acids. He added it all up and then he said, this is how much protein you need. Guess how much protein he said? 20. I got a 20. All right. Wow, somebody's on the ball. Well, you could all see the numbers were going down, right? Okay, so Dr. Rose said 20. Does it work? Can you live on 20? Well, the Bantus, these are people that live over in Somalia, they get about 350 milligrams of calcium per day, and only 10% of their diet is protein. Well, they have 5 to 15 children. They have no calcium deficiency. They have strong bones and teeth, and there are no hip fractures. I'm going to come back to that again when we have a chart of different countries, but this is an important point. They don't get much calcium, they don't get too much protein, and they don't have the trouble of hip fractures. We're not predicting that by the year 2020 they're going to have 50% of their people with osteoporosis over the age of 50 like we say in America. All right, the World Health Organization has made this statement. No frank signs of calcium deficiency have ever been described in any part of the world, even in populations with habitually low calcium intake. No calcium deficiency. I have a bunch of medical books back in my office. You open them up, there's no such thing as a disease called calcium deficiency. Isn't that interesting? What about the Eskimos? You ever feel like an Eskimo? Not this winter, huh? We've had a pretty mild winter, haven't we? Maybe last year, but the Eskimos have a problem. Despite the fact they get 2,000 milligrams of dietary calcium, and some studies show almost 3,000, and high levels of physical activity, the Eskimos have the highest rates of osteoporosis in the world. Why is that? Their daily protein intake averages 250 to 400 grams. What are they eating? Blubber. Yeah, whales or whatever. Okay, so this is, you get the impression we're talking about the protein myth? I'll take questions at the end if it's all right.
I have trouble figuring out what grams are. How does grams relate to pounds?
Oh, grams to pounds. There's 2.2 pounds per kilogram, right?
Kilogram is 1,000.
There we go. He's got the number. What is that again?
454 grams per pound.
454 grams per pound. Thank you. Okay, hip fractures and proteins. Here's the important slide. Look very closely at this one. Across the bottom, I'm going to put dietary intake of animal protein. Across the top, I'm going to put hip fractures, 100 and 200 per 100,000. At the bottom here, we're going to put South Africa. Remember we said the Africans had almost no hip fractures and they're on a very low protein diet. Now, where is the United States going to fall on this map? Way over there. High in animal protein, high in hip fractures. England, not quite as high in animal protein, not as high in hip fractures. We can draw a line through that, can't we? But we don't have to just use those nations. You put all the countries in the world and they line right up just like that. Notice nobody is up here. In other words, nobody is low in animal protein and having lots of hip fractures, and nobody is over here. In other words, there's no nation where they're eating lots of animal protein and having low hip fractures. That is the slide with all the evidence. Okay, where do we get our phosphorus? Remember I said we'd come back to phosphorus? Where do we get our phosphorus? Here's my pie graph. There's dairy products have a lot of phosphorus. Countries where more dairy products are eaten have higher rates of osteoporosis. The phosphorus tends to leach the calcium out. Then there are the meat and poultry products. Again, high in this problem mineral. And I'll just put them all up here quick. You can see that vegetable products have a lot less. And when it's all said and done, 64% of the phosphorus people eat comes from animal products. A lot of phosphates. You see, phosphorus and sulfates, which we could also do a graph of, but I didn't, cause calcium to leach out of the bones. They're an acid. The calcium is used to buffer the acid in the kidney. Okay, U.S. diet. Does that look like a good breakfast? People are reserved in their answer here. What's the matter? Okay. All right, here is our, ham and cheese omelet. We'll just see how much protein we're getting for breakfast here. 3 egg, ham, and cheese omelet, 46 grams of protein. Wow, I don't think Dr. Rose would eat that, do you? All right, the hash browns have 3, the toast has 5, the coffee with cream 1, and even the orange juice has protein. You can't hide from protein, by the way. And you add that all up and we have 56 grams of protein just for breakfast. You've got all the protein you need for the whole day. All right, how about lunch? Big Mac, fries, and a shake. Wow, 40 more grams of protein. Can't win for losing, huh? All right. Okay, for supper though, we're going to take it easy. We're going to eat the white meat. Just a little bit of fried chicken, right? Okay, fried chicken, very good. 55 grams of protein. Oh, and a total of 82. That's a lot. Everything has protein. Even the peas, look at that. 5 grams of protein. Wow. Dr. Rose could just eat 4 servings of peas and have all the protein he needed for the day. Okay, breakfast, let's just add it all up. 56, 40, and 80, and the total comes out to 178. We're going to catch up with the Eskimos, aren't we? Well, most people say, oh, but I don't eat breakfast. Okay, you don't eat breakfast. No breakfast. What's that add up to? Still 122. Well, that's even more than what Dr. Voigt said the Germans were eating. We eat a lot of protein in America. Okay, what happens when we eat all this protein anyway? Well, first of all, you have a progressive loss of renal function. Dialysis, here I come. That's no good. And then there's kidney stones. Ouch! People say that's the most painful thing, even more than childbirth. Oh, and then there's gouty arthritis. It used to be, in the old days, only the kings got this imperial disease. Now everybody can share in this royal affliction. All right. It promotes tumor growth. Oh, don't go there. All right. Calcium is lost in the urine. We call it the calciuric effect. But you pee out your calcium. You lose your calcium. That's the effects of a high-protein diet. Okay, what about the recommendations? You've seen all these, nutritional facts and what we should eat and what we shouldn't eat. Well, in 1941, some of you remember that day, I don't. 1941, we were recommending that men get 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight. Ended up being 70 for men. Well, 1941, that was back to ways. Then we came along and said, no, that's too much. So we lowered it to 0.8, or that's 1980, to 56 for a man and 44 for a woman. Oh, okay. Recommendations. They keep changing. All right, well, okay. Guidelines. I have a chart here. And this is percentage, and this is different items. Men. Men are ignoring the guidelines. They get about 95% too much salt. Women, about 75% too much salt. Folate, about 90% of people are getting enough folate. Guess what percent of people are getting enough vitamin C? 90 I got? Well, 66. All right, and there's 60% of the people are getting enough vitamin A. 50% of the people are getting enough magnesium. Guess what percent of the people are getting the required or the recommended amount of calcium? 25%. I heard it out there. Only 25% of the people are even getting what we recommend. Okay, how about vitamin E? What percent of the people do you think get enough vitamin E? 5%. How many people are getting enough fiber? 5%. How many people even know or care what the guidelines are? 4%.
Oh dear.
So much for guidelines. Okay. WHO says that you should get 50 grams of protein in one of their presentations. Well, let's go back to the protein standards, okay? Recommended. Let's talk about this recommended. Did you know that the recommended is quite a bit more than what if you got below that amount you'd go into deficiency? It's actually almost double what you would need before you go into deficiency. We call this the recommended, but the deficiency level is called the minimal daily requirement. And for protein, the minimal daily requirement is 0.45 grams of protein per day, per kilogram. And that ends up being about 30 grams of protein for a male. That's still more than Dr. Rose suggested, but that's a lot lower than 122 for the people who don't eat breakfast. So Americans eating 90 to 130 grams of protein are eating a lot. Down here I say if enough calories are eaten, protein deficiency is a non-entity. I had a friend who was taking dietetics classes in order to become a registered dietitian. And one of her jobs as a student was to go to the local supermarket and figure out what it would take to put together a low protein diet. She spent all day at the supermarket, finally gave up. She couldn't come up with a low protein diet. And you'll see here a little bit later, if you ate nothing but broccoli, you get more than enough protein. I'll have that on a slide coming up though. Okay, now if we were to look for a standard as to how much protein you should really eat, don't you think breast milk would be a good place to look? Why, that's naturally occurring food made especially for humans. 1 cup of each of these things. Human breast milk, 2.6 grams of protein, compared to formula, which is about double that, and milk from a cow, which is about 3 times that much protein. Very interesting, huh? Maybe breast milk would be a good standard. Okay. Getting enough protein. Where do we get our protein? If you weren't going to eat all this meat, where would you get your protein? Beans. Did you know beans have a lot of protein?
Yeah.
Beans have a lot of protein. And this is 1 cup of probably soybeans, but different beans have a lot of protein. Whole wheat bread, soy milk, potatoes, and brown rice. You can't avoid protein. And how about protein per 100 calories, a small serving? All right, let's look at plant sources first. All right, an apple, 0.5. Well, you might not get a lot of protein if you ate only apples, but you get some. Oranges, 2. Wow, that's a lot. And then you get down here to whole wheat, 4 grams of protein per 100 calories. And then you get down to pinto beans, 6 grams of protein. There's a lot of protein out there. But then you go to animal sources, notice it just goes up and up and up, and fish is almost pure protein. A lot of protein there. Okay, let's talk about these 8 essential amino acids that Dr. Rose came up with. Here they are. And this is my graph of how much of each of those you need. You know, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, there's all kinds of them. But this is the graph of the recommended by Dr. Rose of how much of the 8 essential amino acids you need. Well, what about if we compare that to different foods? Here's broccoli. Look how much protein is in broccoli of each of the 8 essential amino acids compared to Rose's standard. If you ate nothing but broccoli, you'd get enough protein. You get a lot of it. Even if you ate sweet potatoes, baked potato, brown rice, you know, tomatoes. Look at that. There's protein everywhere. Well, let's talk about Dr. Rose. If we compare our diet to Rose's standard, how much do each of the diets vary from his standard? Take a pure vegetarian diet. It only varies from Rose's standard by 28%. It's very similar. How about a meat diet? It varies from Rose's standard by almost 50%. Well, who says Rose was right? Well, let's go back to the breast milk then. How much does a pure vegetarian diet vary in amino acid content from breast milk, 13%. And a meat diet by 22%. Very interesting. All right, where can you get your calcium? Well, if all you ate is oatmeal, you might not get enough calcium, right? Well, maybe that's what the Bantus are eating, though. I don't know. All right. But if we go down this list, you see that even dandelions have calcium. You ever gone out and picked a few dandelion greens and put them in your salad? I see somebody nodding. I have. And then here's kale. That's what we usually decorate our salads with. That's usually the most nutritious thing on many salad bars. But they have it there for decoration. You ought to grab a little bit of it. Kind of strong tasting, but it's good for you. And then here I'm going to put up a bunch of little items. Here's turnip greens, and as we go up the list, it goes at dried figs, 269. You can find calcium everywhere. But now I'm going to put up milk products. Now there's a trick here, and that is this. Because milk is so high in protein, only 30% of that gets absorbed. And then because it's so high in phosphates and sulfates, most of it gets washed out in the urine. But if you're eating the greens, you don't have that trouble. And now down here, look what's the highest. Lamb's quarters. What's lamb's quarters? Weeds, they say. Weeds. I like it. I think it tastes better than spinach. It grew in my garden last year. I mean, I didn't plant it, but it is a weed. But it's good. When I was growing up, we used to go out and pick it and cook it up like spinach. All right. But I'll take my estrogen. I don't have any problem. My estrogen will fix my osteoporosis problem. Yeah, but they quit giving people estrogen, you know, for that, because of the high risk of cancer. They were doing a bunch of studies a couple years ago, and they stopped all the studies. They said, we can't let these women continue to take this because they're all going to get cancer. New studies show elevated risk of endometrial cancer. That's a problem. It increases that risk of cancer by 10 times, risk of gallbladder disease by 3 times. It actually doubles the risk of breast cancer, increased risk of blood clots. We call it thrombophlebitis. Risk of hypertension goes up, and there is not a sustained benefit to the bones. Long term, it doesn't pan out. So we've kind of quit doing that. All right, quiz time. How many % per year do postmenopausal women lose of bone mass? 3% per year, right? 3% per year is how, remember that slide I said there's going to be a quiz on? Everybody's going to sleep. Turn on the air conditioner, everybody's getting hot. All right. Okay, if you lose 3% per year in the postmenopausal years of your bone mass, 3% per year, and we test these people for 26 months, how many % do you think they'll lose from their bones? Yeah, nearly 7. Somebody said 7. 6.6. But if we have people who exercise and they're giving their bones something to do, they actually ended up increasing their bone mass just a little bit. Well, it's better to gain than to lose, isn't it? So exercise more than anything else helped in this study. All right. Let's see if my thing will work here.
Service message from the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons.
All right, physical activity and risk of hip fracture. People who don't get much activity have the highest risk of hip fracture. The more active you get, the lower the risk goes. This was a 12-year study. So, activity, most important. How about vitamin D? We started talking about vitamin D. They did a study on a group of people up here in Maine, and they fed a bunch of them 800 units of vitamin D and calcium. And the rest they called controls. The risk of hip fracture reduced by 43% in those people taking the vitamin D. 800 units. That's quite a lot, actually. But I've had some doctors suggest to their patients that if they're having some osteoporosis issues, that they should even take 800 twice a day. A lot of times they feel that maybe we aren't getting enough vitamin D. Studies that have gone and they've checked a whole bunch of people in the population say that on an average Americans are deficient in vitamin D. This was a study of over 3,000 women. Their average age was 84. It was for 18 months. And they gave half of them the vitamin D and the other half, and I already told you about this. The density changes were interesting. Those who were taking the vitamin D had an increase in density in their bone mass of 2.7%. Those who were in the placebo group, or the controls, ended up with a reduction in bone mass over 18 months of 4.6%. And that's here in New England. That was the New England Journal of Medicine. All right, diet. Okay, what are our suggestions? Here's our suggestions. RX, right? You see that on the pharmacies. Lower intake of all animal products, including fish and fowl. Remember, the fish were really high in protein. That'll reduce your protein. Also will help your cholesterol and your fat. But reducing the protein is important. Then increase your complex carbohydrates, especially from sources you know will be high in calcium. Thirdly, increase vegetables, especially vegetables that you know are high in calcium. If you're having trouble with osteoporosis, that would be very good. And here's all our cabbage and so forth. Okay, so what should we eat? Let's be very specific. Eat an unrefined, plant-based diet. And how does that look? Well, it looks like the Bible diet, actually. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with a seed in it. They will be yours for food. And you will eat the plants of the field. Grains, fruits, and nuts, and vegetables constitute the diet chosen for us by our Creator. These foods, prepared in as simple and natural a manner as possible, are the most healthful and nourishing. They impart a strength, a power of endurance, and a vigor of intellect that are not afforded by a more complex diet. Okay, if you're going to prevent osteoporosis and or treat it, then the first thing is to lower your protein, preferably below 60 grams, since most people get about twice that much. And then the next thing is to maintain the USRDA of calcium. We've actually gone up on that. Should be 1,000, but I haven't changed my slide yet. But they're actually going up on their suggestion, 1,000 for non-pregnant women and 1,200 for pregnant women. So you keep your bones solid. Oh, look who's that. Little guy jumping there. All right. Regular exercise program consistent with health and age. Don't need to run marathons the first day. And avoid smoking, sugar, chocolate, alcohol, and caffeine. Avoid salt. Reduce your salt to less than 1 teaspoon per day. 1/4 of a teaspoon would be sufficient. And then 6, maintain a daily vitamin D intake of 800 units. Oh, and by the way, some of the biggest animals that ever walked our earth were vegetarians, and some of their bones are still hanging around today. Dinosaurs. At Parkview, we have our Lifestyle Choices program. This is a program where we give lectures just like the one you heard tonight, and we help people get on a good lifestyle program that will help with heart disease, diabetes, osteoporosis, hypertension. It runs for 10 days. The next one is in May, and people get their cholesterol reduced by an average of 50 points, triglycerides reduced by 20 points. The average weight loss is 7 pounds. LDL, the bad cholesterol, usually reduces by 46 points. Body fat reduced by 1.5%. People get their glucose and blood sugar under control. So if you have questions about that, you can ask Amy for more information or call our number down here. And that's the end.
Thank you.
So now we have time for questions. Just don't make them too hard. Oh, let's see. I saw a bunch of hands. I'll start over here.
My name is Nikki Mulhite. I'm on Actonel,
Uh-huh.
and I'm wondering what effects it will do to my bones if I have to have surgery done to bones. How I understand there's a problem with some of the medications.
Oh, interesting. Actonel is okay, the question is, she's on Actonel, a medicine used for osteoporosis. She's heard that it causes trouble for surgery, and she's wondering what the effect will be. What kind of problems have you heard that it causes for surgery?
Well, my daughter is a hygienist, and she received a letter saying that before they do any surgery, they should check into it because it does something to the bones.
Oh, okay. Actonel is like Fosamax. It's a bisphosphonate. It's a drug that basically gets incorporated into your bones. So when your bones are made, a calcium gets put in your bones and some phosphate. But if you're taking Fosamax or Actonel, instead of a phosphate getting incorporated, a Fosamax gets incorporated. And you end up with a bone that's made of a new material. And when the osteoclast comes along to make withdrawals, it tries to eat the Fosamax or the Actonel, and it can't eat it. It says, yuck, it doesn't taste good. And it won't eat it. And so it ends up with a bone that stays around better. If you take Fosamax or Actonel, or there's some new ones out there now, if you take those for a long period of time, you can actually increase your bone mass by as much as 7%. Sometimes, if we're going to operate on somebody that's really osteoporotic, we'll have them take a medication like Actonel, or the newer ones out there, the injectable ones, Forteo. There's the old ones they used to spray up their nose, the salmon calcitonin. We sometimes put people on those for a while. About 6 months ago, we had a lady in the hospital whose bones were very thin. And so we put her on Forteo injections, and made a lot of difference. Forteo can increase the bone mass by 12%, calcitonin less than Fosamax. I'm not sure the exact number on that. Let's see, the next one was over here somewhere. Yes.
I always thought that dairy products, the yogurt, the cottage cheese, the drinking milk was the thing we're supposed to do, and the way this thing went sounded like it was the thing we wasn't supposed to do.
Okay, the question is, she had always heard that milk was good for bones, cottage cheese and dairy products, and she says, today it sounded like you weren't supporting that theory. That's right. Most of the charts that they used to put up for kids in the schools about what they should eat were an advertisement by some private interest groups who were involved in the production of those particular items. And so when you saw my picture here where, Dr. Phil had his milk mustache and the cow had the milk mustache, that's all a campaign. It isn't necessarily proven in the medical literature. Now, when the studies first started coming out that animal protein was really bad for bones, a lot of those companies also started sponsoring studies. And the studies started changing their minds. And then the news got a hold of those studies. So it's a battle. It doesn't just happen in the advertising marketplace. It also happens in the science room, which scientists you can influence. So it's a problem. Let's see. Right here.
Do you acknowledge you compared us to the people of Africa.
Uh-huh.
And now you realize, of course, the people in Africa, probably 99% of them are intolerant of milk.
Yes,
So they don't drink milk.
that's
And
right.
they have another whole set of tolerances than we do.
Uh-huh.
So I think that has got to be acknowledged. And they found this out in some of the New York City schools where they're giving the kids graham crackers and milk in the middle of the morning. And half of the class was throwing up before 11 o'clock. So they stopped. But now a facetious question. We're not supposed to smoke, drink, and we go on with all of these things. And this reminds me of the 100-year-old who was asked how he lived to be 100. He said, well, and he mentioned all of these things, and this made a long life. The reporter just looked at her and he says, how in the world are you going to celebrate? You want to help us on that one?
Sure, you bet. Okay, the two questions. Number one, he says it may not be fair to compare us to the Africans because they are lactose intolerant. They couldn't drink milk if they had to. And the second thing is, how are you going to celebrate when you get old if you can't have the good things? All right, as far as the Africans go, the lactose intolerance is something that even a lot of Americans get with time. It seems that human beings are the only species on Earth that think they have to remain on baby food their whole life, which is really unusual. And so the consequences of that we're paying for. The thing about celebrating, I met a doctor just last week who was telling a story about when his mom retired from a busy business office meeting. I mean, she had worked at this business for like 30 years, and she was retiring. And so she went to retire, and they threw a big party for her. And they fed her all kinds of, junk food and sweets and things that are high in oils and so forth. Well, if you ever see my lecture on arthritis, you'll see that those are all a problem. That night, she had a stroke. She stroked out half of her brain. And so now she gets to spend the rest of her retirement with only one side of her body working because she decided to celebrate and eat all this stuff that she didn't normally eat. When I was in college down in Massachusetts, I was kind of a poor college student. I found there was a lady in the community who had been a teacher at the college. She was 97 years old. And she was bright as a tack, sharp as a tack. She was doing basically the alumni association work for the people who were older than 80 of the college. Well, they decided to honor her, and she would board and room several boys, and so I was one of those. Well, they decided to honor her. Mrs. So-and-so, you've spent all this time helping us out. We're going to start feeding you food from our cafeteria. Well, they started sending over stuff. When she ate by herself, she would eat collard greens and beans and lots of nice things like we're talking about here. Well, they started sending her over chocolate cake every day and refine this and refine that, and well, pretty soon she wasn't doing very good. In fact, by the time she was 100, she'd gone into total dementia, couldn't remember who she was and what was going on. And we all accused the cafeteria of killing her, but she ended up dying. But if she'd stayed on her diet that she was used to, she would have done a lot better. So it's a danger to celebrate with stuff that isn't good for you. That may not be a good celebration. Let's see, over here.
I want to ask you about decaffeinated things, decaffeinated coffee.
Mm-hmm.
Is it really decaffeinated or is it only partially decaffeinated?
In decaffeinated coffee, there's still about like 5 to 7 milligrams of caffeine in it. But the problem with coffee isn't just isolated to the caffeine. It's actually a lot of the oils in the coffee that are hard on you and even on your bones. And so just eliminating the caffeine does not eliminate the problems associated with coffee. You see, they take those beans and they cook them till they're almost burnt. And we know that when you burn something, you end up developing carcinogens and other problems, other products that aren't necessarily normal. I had a chemistry teacher, organic chemistry teacher, when I was in college from Worcester Polytechnical Institute, and he used to talk about taffy. He says, you know, we started studying taffy. They heat it up real hot and they, you know, get it to the hard ball or soft ball or whatever. He says, we studied that stuff. He says, it's amazing what kind of products you make when you heat that stuff up like that. He says there's aldehydes and there's, you know, all kinds of stuff in there. And he says, that stuff's dangerous. But heating stuff up real hot, you know, we don't know what we do to it. Over here.
On calcium, I was told you take only 600 mgs of calcium at a time, and you take it 6 hours apart from each other. Now, what happens to you if you overtake calcium, take a lot of calcium? Because I take 1,500 mgs a day to prevent osteoporosis. And the second question, sir, is I take my calcium pill with other supplements. How is the stomach handling that? Is the calcium pill really get all digested? Thank you.
Yes, the question is, she's heard that you should only take 600 milligrams of calcium at a time. And she also takes her calcium with other pills, and she wonders what the stomach does with all that. It is true that your body can only absorb so much at one time. And this is true of a number of different vitamins, like vitamin C, you can't absorb more than 500. Calcium has a limit. I've heard that even 500 is questionable whether you can absorb it all at one time. And so it's basically a matter of, you know, how much your body can handle. And so the reason they say spread your calcium out is if you take it all at once, it just all ends up in the stool, and that's non-productive. As far as mixing it with other minerals and vitamins and pills, your body only has a capacity of absorbing so much stuff at once. There's only so many doors for stuff to go through, you know. And if you have 20 people lined up at one door, some of them might not make it through. So there is...
So when you're taking your calcium or you're taking a lot of supplements at the same time, you're really wasting your money.
She says if you're taking a whole lot of supplements all at once, you're really wasting your money.
But the body's not absorbing it.
Because the body's not absorbing. That's true. Yep. And a lot of it ends up in your urine anyway, because your urine ends up really yellow, right? Yes. Okay, question over here.
Yeah, I'd like to know if there's a correlation between the amount of calcium you take, because I'm pre-osteoporosis, and the deposits of calcium in your body. I tend to make microcalcifications in my breast, or does it get deposited elsewhere in your body if you take too much?
Oh, good question. She asked, she's taking a lot of calcium because she's got pre-osteoporosis. And at the same time, she's finding that she's getting calcifications throughout her body. She's wondering if she's taking too much calcium and the calcium is depositing in places where it shouldn't be. That's a good question. I haven't heard any really good answers on that. Whether or not you can absorb too much calcium and it can get in places. The studies do show that some people are more susceptible to the calcifications in the breasts, in the joints, and in different tissues. And sometimes it's a genetic thing. I've had people come in with what we call a chondrocalcinosis. Their cartilage is getting calcium in it. And it makes the cartilage hard, and then pretty soon the cartilage fractures and breaks. It's no longer soft. And I looked up all over the place on that, looked up in the literature, and all they could say was, well, this is inherited. There isn't anything to do about it. So I'm not sure if that can happen. Now, as far as the regulation of calcium in your system, it's very finely regulated. I don't really believe you could up the amount of calcium in your system too terribly high. It would be very hard to. I've seen a few companies out there advertising, if you take our special calcium pills, you'll absorb 99% of it. If you really absorbed 99% of everything you took, you could overload your system in a hurry. So I don't think that's probably true. But as far as if you take too much calcium, is that why you're getting calcifications in your breast? Probably not. You probably have either an inherited disposition to deposit calcium in your tissues or some other disease process going on that's attracting the calcium. Let's see. Let's go back over here.
And your ratio of calcium to protein, Does it make a difference whether it's animal protein or vegetable protein?
Okay, the question is, in my ratio of calcium to protein, does it make a difference whether it is animal protein or vegetable protein? Yes, it does. It's because of the quality of the protein. Animal protein has a lot more of the amino acids that are high in sulfates and phosphates. The amino acid methionine, for example, is about twice as high in meat as it is in most vegetable products. It has to do with the amino acids that cause acid in the system. So meat has a lot higher level of those phosphates and sulfates than would, say, vegetables or greens.
On your charts, when you were talking about the animal fat, you're not giving, you didn't give any amounts. I guess we're always trying to stay away from meat, and we've gone to chicken and fish in our diet. Now I'm learning that, you know, fish is high. I mean, we have we use salmon and tuna and haddock and different things of that nature. So where do you go? I mean, how do you know how much?
How much protein?
How much protein, you know, that you can get away with it,
Okay.
in a portion. I guess a portion is what I'm talking about.
Okay, the question is, she has gone to getting away from some meats and is shifting toward chicken and fish. And she's wondering, how do you know how much chicken and fish you can get away with, right?
Basically.
Basically, good question. I don't know, I'm a vegetarian. I don't have a good answer for that.
Can you tell us the benefits of fish oil, pills, or vitamins?
Benefits of fish oil or vitamins as far as osteoporosis goes? I don't know of any benefits for osteoporosis from taking fish oils. People usually take fish oils because they want to get omega-3. A lot of times they end up getting a lot of the contaminants that come from the fish as well, DDT and mercury and so forth. But you don't have to take fish oil to get the omega-3s. You can take flax oil or primrose oil or even olive oil. But I don't know any benefits for osteoporosis.
Is it contradictory to take Fosmax and then half an hour later take 1,200 milligrams of calcium?
Okay, the question is it a contradiction to take Fosamax at one time and a few hour later take calcium? They make you take Fosamax on an empty stomach, don't they, before breakfast, so that it doesn't have that problem of competing with other pills or foods. And so they expect that within a half hour that pill will be absorbed. Once it's gone and absorbed, then the system is ready for something else, and then you could take your 500-600 milligrams of calcium and get benefit from it.
However, they relate all these figures with physical sizes and features.
Okay, the question is, how do they relate all these recommendations with physical size and features? The real recommendations are based on your weight. The recommendation is to get 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Or, if you're talking about the minimal requirement, 0.45 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So it is based on your weight. So that's the way they adjust that.
I think you want to explain the difference between grams and milligrams is 1,000. The difference between grams and micrograms is what, 10,000? So 600 milligrams of calcium is only 0.6 grams.
0.6 grams, yes.
The measurements here are a little bit, I hope some of these people have seen the significance of one place you've got grams and one place you've got milligrams, and the measurements get confusing.
He wants us all to be aware that most of the time here we're talking about protein in grams and calcium in milligrams, and that's 1,000-fold different. Back in the back.
There's so many different types of calcium, like citrate and carbonate. How do you, I've read that some are much better at the body absorbing certain ones than others. How do you know which is the best to take?
Good question. How do you know which calcium is the best calcium to take? Which one will absorb the best? And there's a lot of people advertising different calciums. You notice I had a coral calcium up there, pet calcium, all these different calciums. Well, they used to say that calcium citrate was the best for absorbing. Then you had this whole company, you know, was it Citracal? Yeah, and so that's the one I've always told people because the studies originally came out and said that. All in all, as long as you're getting some calcium, you're probably doing well. There's probably very few calciums that are totally non-absorbable, but it's good to get your calcium. Are we about out of town?
We can take one more question. We actually have another group coming in.
Okay, one more question and that'll be it. Back in the back.
I always thought that eating fish was good for you. But is that type of protein exactly the same as meat protein? Not particularly better?
Okay, question is, she'd always heard that eating fish protein was the better protein for you. And she's wondering if the fish protein is the same as the other animal protein. And fish protein, you notice we said our tuna fish was probably the highest in protein of anything we had on our chart. And so tuna fish or different fish is a meat protein, and it does have the high incident or the high amounts of the amino acids that cause acid in your system. Fish has come under a lot of attack recently because of some of the contaminants. We haven't used DDT in this country as a poison on our farms and so forth in 35 years. Yet if you go to Alaska and catch a salmon, it'll have toxic levels of DDT. That's because in America we're the greatest producer and exporter of banned pesticides of any country in the world. They use it down in Australia, they use it in South America. It gets in the water, it gets in the fish, and then you have toxic levels. You have to make sure you know where your animal products are coming from. If you go to Chicago and they catch a fish out of the Great Lake and they sell it in one of their restaurants, they'll have to put up a sign, if you're pregnant, don't eat more than one of these in 6 months or something, because it's got high levels of toxins.